Welcome back to You and Your Money. We're discussing healthcare this evening. My guest, Clayton Samsudin. And if you'd like to email, my details will appear on the screen. Clayton, before I get into email, let's just talk a little bit about this. What can someone in retirement do? Someone who's not well, someone who now upgrades their scheme, because I'm very concerned, and I've made the point before. If inflation is running at 9%, your medical aid costs are going to double in 8 years' time. And in a further 8 years' time, another doubling. So someone who's paying 15,000 Rand in 16 years' time, when they're in their mid-70s or even close to 80, and people may think these numbers are nonsense. You're going to be paying 60,000 Rand a month. And your pension and your income requirements are not increasing at that level. What can someone do? I mean, let's talk about myself for a moment. I'm on an executive plan.
Yeah.
So I'm paying over 20,000 Rand a month. Also, I can't understand why I've got so many co-payments. I can't believe it. I picked up my medicines this month, and my co-payments were 1,200 Rand. So if I add that, and again, so what do you suggest an older person does? I mean, you and I have sat down and you've said this is what you can do. But what do people in retirement say? I just can't afford this. What do I do?
So, look, I think what we have to understand firstly is the cover, and again I go back to a standard way of looking at things. It sounds simple, but I'm going to try and make it simple. The first thing is to ensure that you have cover for major medical conditions, ailments. So I'm referring to hospital, cancer, HIV, cardio care, diabetes. That you've got to make sure
Stroke.
Correct. Well, that's under cardio.
Yeah.
So you've got to make sure that you've got sufficient cover for those events that could present you with a financial catastrophe if you don't have cover for that. That's the first thing. The other thing is when we get to the chronic situation now. So this is a big thing. We have members that would purchase a particular plan thinking this is going to give them more benefits, when in effect, if you look at the conditions they have, it's covered in one of that 27 chronic conditions. So that is already covered, let's just say, unlimited through a specific provider. And here's the key thing, you know, when you mentioned the chronic queries that you have and the co-payments that you've made, the reason for that is the medical scheme, even on the highest option, and I'm glad you mentioned that, even on the most expensive option on Discovery Health, you have what Discovery calls, and other medical schemes do too, it's called a medicine formulary. And that medicine formulary says, if you suffer from this condition, on this option, these are the medicines we are prepared to fund. And if your specialist or doctor prescribe a medication outside of that, you get what is called a chronic drug amount, and the difference becomes a co-payment. So upgrading to the highest plan does not necessarily mean that your chronic medication will be paid in full. If you look at it line by line, you could have saved, I'm not saying you, because your situation is different, but another member could have paid significantly less just by ensuring that they understand how the chronic formulary works.
Clayton, when a pharmacy says you can take something else for a particular drug that's on the prescription, are they clued up enough to give that advice?
So I think what we need to understand here, Bryan, is there are three very important things to know. Number one, you have the medicine formulary. Please don't forget that. So every year medical schemes change that chronic medicine formulary, meaning you could have qualified for a drug this year that was on the formulary that was paid in full. In 2025, if they change that formulary, that drug is no longer funded, or the specific dosage is no longer funded, and that would result in a co-payment. So that's one scenario you have to understand. The other is what you've just mentioned now. It's the ethical drug and the generic. So from clients or patients that have multiple conditions, it's not just easy for the pharmacist. You're correct in saying, you know, if you take the generic, it means you're going to pay less. You know, in multiple condition scenarios where there are certain specialists treating the patient, they, you know, don't allow that kind of deviation according to what their prescription says. So if that specialist says this is what you need to have, that's what you need to have. And there's a reason for them saying, this argument that the ethical drug and the generic drug is the same. I'm not a physician, I'm not going to argue this. All I'm going to do is look to somebody that has, that is a specialist, that I have studied in that field, that says, listen, for my patient, this is what the requirement medication is, and you can't change it.
But are they all clued up on all the new drugs coming onto the market?
No.
So if a pharmacist says to you that you could take this drug, which is a lot less compared to that drug, the answer would be go back to the specialist, say, this is what I've been offered, can I do it? Would that be sufficient?
Yeah, particularly now you've got to, again, let's place it into context. If it is a simple scenario of you have a flu, and you go to the counter and you've got no other associated conditions, and they say, well, the doctor prescribed this, but here's a generic and you'll save on your medical savings account. That's an easy thing to do. Yes, well, I'll go the route of the generic because I don't have any other complications. But if you have other multiple conditions and complications, then you can't divert from the prescription. That would just be silly.
Well, I'm going to get some emails through this week. Diane in Parker says, on your recent show, you discussed healthcare package designed to address gaps in medical aid coverage. How has the uptake been so far, and consumers beginning to recognize that medical aids often fall short on covering all healthcare needs?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to the viewer for recognizing what we spoke about the last time. But look, on average, not average, but I think about just over a quarter of our corporates have now implemented a primary healthcare product in addition. Some have gone the route where it's compulsory and actually funded the contribution, and others have made it voluntary. And in doing the voluntary scenario, they've secured preferential underwriting, and they've also secured a lower premium. So, it's good to see that corporates are saying, wait a minute, we need to change here. We can't continue doing the same thing year after year after year, and we have the same level of dissatisfaction. And the dissatisfaction is not about, it's more on the day-to-day side. It's not the major medical scenarios. It's the fact that I'm running out of medical savings. I have a self-payment gap to pay. My above threshold is limited now. Every time I go or do something or want to access healthcare benefits, I've got a co-payment, and so people become apprehensive already. Going to the pharmacies, am I going to pay 1,200 co-payment this month or 1,800,
Clayton, there's a bigger problem because people reaching retirement who have been maybe sheltered a little bit by the medical aids being picked up by the company, and then whatever the distribution was, cost to company or company picking up the cost. When they actually now move out of their employment, there could be some big shocks ahead of them. But Clayton, let me ask you this question. I'm going to this really, the payment you get, the commission earned, and the work you do. I mean, you go and see a doctor, and you see a physician, and they'll charge you tariff, not even in tariff, for that visit, 3,500 rand. And that's, they may see you once a year. You get, what sort of commission do you get from placing a medical aid? It's limited, isn't it?
3% of the premium to a maximum of 116 rand.
116 rand, which means you've got a year's work for 1,500 rand.
That's right. Well, think of it like this. If we go into the low-cost options, so those that's paying 1,055 rand, 1,350 rand, 3% of that is what we get. So 35 rand could be the order of the day.
That's 420 a year.
Correct.
And you may be talking to the clients 5, 6, 7 times during the course of the year.
Correct.
I mean, how, from a broker's perspective, from a healthcare consultant, how are you coping?
Well, look, I think it's becoming a scenario where it's unsustainable. Firstly, the medical schemes are becoming more complicated. Compliance is becoming more onerous, and when you start to look at those two things, educating the member becomes a lot more challenging, particularly the individuals, where if you were to do something via the corporate, of course, when you educate and there's an education drive, many attend, many understand, many is up to date. When we talk about the individuals and particularly the retired members, it becomes very difficult. The technology is a train smash for retired individuals. They just don't have access to to the, let's just say, the technology that they should. And so, you know, we also work on a scenario where not everyone is going to have a query at the same time, you know, and not everyone's going to query at the same time. So you can kind of have this cross-subsidization going on.
But that's query. I'm
Correct.
talking about come the end of the year.
No.
Then there's work to be done. No one's got
Correct.
queries. It's work to be done to evaluate. I mean, you know, I must tell you, I'm very supportive of the industry doing the right jobs, as you've heard. That's why we spend so much time on healthcare, because the costs are today, but the future costs are enormous. Let me try and get through one more email from Mervyn in Parktown. He says, I'm on a comprehensive plan, and yet many of my benefits seem limited or out quickly. What does this happen, and what steps can I take to minimize out-of-pocket expenses?
So
I think you've dealt with a lot of that, haven't you?
yeah, it's the unfortunate thing, Bryan, is even when you have a medical savings, you will have a co-payment out-of-pocket experience somewhere. You are worse off in your self-payment gap, because now you have to fund everything. And when you get to your above threshold, it's also limited. So what I'm trying to say in a nutshell, Bryan, and I think this is the question, and we have to start talking about this and saying, you know, and please forgive me for the analogy. I can buy a maintenance plan for my vehicle and have zero co-payments. I can't buy a healthcare plan for myself in South Africa and have peace of mind that I'm covered in full. And, you know, so we are attaching more importance to vehicles than what we are to life in South Africa. And everyone needs to start talking that language.
Yeah. And I think it's critical because, as you say, one of the primary objectives of this show, which has been running for over 20 years, is not only to inform, but also to educate viewers on the various topics we cover. In my view, the healthcare episodes, which air every 5 to 7 weeks, are amongst the most vital. With medical aid inflation at approximately 9%, your medical aid costs will double every 8 years and quadruple in 16 years. Even if you haven't yet taken the opportunity this year to consult with a healthcare broker to reassess critical components such as disability cover, severe illness, insurance, medical aid and gap cover, then I feel I haven't fulfilled my responsibility effectively. Clayton, thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
It's important to note that our program is to provide information and should not be construed as advice. Next week's program will once again focus on short-term insurance. Thank you for watching, and good night.